can't believe for a workshop.
But from this,
This one,
the complete change in your market, I mean,
all three of our commissioners
would be, yeah,
especially for a publicly noticed mission.
yeah. I mean, it wouldn't be they wouldn't have,
Yeah.
you've already noticed it, so it's a public meeting.
Yeah, I don't know.
Just, we're not interested.
I'm trying to figure it out.
That is,
Every state's different.
I guess we should make sure none of these microphones are on.
Can they see us today?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, that's good.
Look over
Well, you can
here.
see over here, you can see
You
us.
can see over here, you can see us, so I assume that means they can see us there.
Okay.
So you were saying, John, that this generation charge is essentially a capacity charge?
I guess so, because I can't figure out what else it is, since it says it's energy on top of that. That must be
That's
their
a general
fix.
rate.
Hmm?
That's your general rate, like with that.
General
What does that
rate?
I don't know if they've split it out.
Well, it says generation.
Energy's up here.
Energy on
Yeah,
top.
so your general rate, that's probably your generation in the general rate.
Well, the transmission and distribution are different parts of those bars.
Yeah, here's transmission distribution.
Right. What you're paying for is capacity, that's the amortization cost of the asset.
That makes sense.
No, we don't.
So you wouldn't have this. Well, that would be, this would probably, but you'd have to probably have that, that'd be a stranded cost
Yeah.
charge for whatever period of time.
Yeah, depending on, but it would be netted against any market revenue you got.
Correct. You're not sure what that number would be for a while, a couple of trip.
Exactly. Will it become a T&D act?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it'll be on the T&D bill. So whatever's stranded would be absorbed down here. A lot of pictures.
I tried to call my PJM guy just to ask.
Just asking how that was dealt with.
I'm 99% sure that they postage stamp them based on where the load is, the
Mhm.
basic principle. And then they have a transmission planning process
Mhm.
that I think it's roughly lead ratio share, but it ends up being a negotiated deal.
Yeah.
That's what I think. I'm trying to verify exactly how that works. But I think the one guy on the panel said, this is an issue everywhere. They always fight about how to allocate the costs according to the benefits in all these multi-state RTOs. It's a common fact. But it's not something that's not worked out.
There's a reason it's based in Arkansas.
Exactly. Well, I did MISO for Constellation and for Reliant. I had a SPP and MISO in Carmel Road.
MISO's in Indianapolis?
Just outside of
You take your
Indianapolis,
notes?
in Carmel.
Oh, okay.
Stick is.
Crooked Stick, yeah.
Yeah, we had it on the CD.
So my phone, you take a picture.
I played that
And it sends it
Yeah,
forward,
it's
with,
whatever you.
when I was with Exelon.
Yes, so I did, the MISO, the
Yeah.
SPP was merging.
And then when you just, no, wipe
So
it off
Carl
later.
Redd is the CEO of SPP.
Uh-huh.
You know, he was like the lead SPP person that lives in Carmel.
Carmel.
Pretty close to the next.
And they, then that all fell apart.
Is that what they call it? Is that how they pronounce it? Carmel?
Carmel, they're like the candy, not like.
We don't call Nevada, Nevada.
Oh, I know. I have to correct people in California all the time.
Since it is a Spanish name though, it really ought to be pronounced Nevada.
That's probably true.
We are back on the record in docket 17-10001 in Carson City, and Joe Reynolds presiding over this matter. We also have a live video feed to Las Vegas. This is day 2 of the investigatory workshop for the Energy Choice Initiative, and we are discussing options for the state regarding the possible creation of a wholesale market. Most of this morning we had the discussion centered around CAISO. Wanted to start off this afternoon with asking the question, has there been any recent efforts underway that anyone's aware of to create a Western regional organization, a Western RTO that Nevada could be a part of or Nevada could join, if anyone is aware of that? And here in Carson City, no one's coming forward, so I hear silence. So I can presume a couple of things from that. One is that there at least are not vigorous efforts on that question. Ms. Barbash from NVE, thank you for coming forward.
Thank you, Chairman Reynolds. As far as forming a Western regional markets, the efforts that I know about are, California ISO's, state of California's attempts to pass some sort of regional governance. Very recently, the Peak Reliability Coordinator, who's the reliability coordinator for the Western Interconnection, just announced efforts along with PJM to provide market services as a way of providing more value to its reliability coordinator funders. That's very preliminary nature. To my knowledge, it's really so far just a press release. And then of course there's the Mountain West Transmission Group who has formed and come to some agreement around transmission rights and transmission operations, and is now looking at integrating with the Southwest Power Pool.
Do you know who are members of the Mountain West Transmission Group?
Oh, I can't say them off the top of my head, but it's a portion of Western Area Power Authority, Black Hills, Excel Energy. Ms. DeWilliger may know that because she just of her experience recently in California, but I don't know I can't recite the names of the parties.
Thinking ahead, and see Mr. Van Cleve came up as well.
Brad Van Cleve for Valley Electric, Mr. Chairman. That group is underway, and I think it includes Tri-State Cooperative, which is a big multi-state co-op. So it's basically Colorado and south of there, but there is also another group looking at joining that effort that includes Public Service of New Mexico, Tucson Electric, Arizona Electric Power Cooperative, and the portion of WAPA that's in the west, basically, the non-Colorado part. But one of the major difficulties with that effort is the Eastern Electric Grid, where the SPP operates, and the Western Electric Grid are not electrically synchronized. So the interconnection between those two regions is through DC interties, and it's very limited. So I think the idea is that SPP might come in and run a market for someone, but as far as integrating Western load into the SPP's actual footprint, which makes a huge amount of sense given the load diversity and all the wind they have, so the resource diversity, but a huge amount of transmission would need to be built to make that happen. So that is like a decade out.
Well, thank you for that. Ms. Terwilliger, any thoughts?
Thank you, Chairman. Debra Terwilliger for staff for the record. The only clarification I would offer, I think Mr. Van Cleve got it right, with the exception of it, I think in New Mexico, PNM is being asked by its commission. I don't know that PNM's decided to join the Mountain West group. I think the commission is interested in having them join, or at least studying it or looking into it. So.
Because it's my understanding when Nevada looked at doing this in the late '90s and early 2000s, about joining, a regional RTO or helping kind of create a regional RTO, we didn't get there, and so was just asking, is there any other entity that we're aware of that's taking the lead on this? To reach out to, another state, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, Colorado, or is that just not on the table, so to speak? Any thoughts, Ms. Barbash?
Yes, Chairman Reynolds. Right now, no, there's no other state or utility transmission owner that's reaching out trying to initiate a Western RTO. I think I would say the closest thing to that would probably be the Peak Reliability and PJM recent announcement to provide market services. And I believe they did hold a webinar yesterday just to discuss maybe a timeline for how they would get interest. But I didn't participate, so I can't give any more detail than that.
And so a little of this is my understanding that if Nevada was interested in going that route, it would be something that Nevada would have to take the lead on and really try to start initiating and moving that ball forward. Is that fair to say in your
I'd say that's fair. I would say the first step would be to identify what other parties are interested. And you're correct in that in the 90s when the Western utilities were looking at this, from Desert Star to Indigo to RTO West, and we were all involved in those many years ago, and dating myself here, but those never came to fruition for several reasons. A lot of it was there was never consensus reached on how to allocate transmission costs, as well as how you integrate the public power agencies, which we have very many of in the western states, and how that affects their preference power and the transmission rights associated with those.
Does anyone else have any other thoughts on the Mr. Van Cleve, go ahead.
If I could add one thing, Mr. Chairman. One of the reasons that the New Mexico Commission has asked PNM to look at possibly joining SPP, and also that the Arizona utilities and the Desert Southwest region of WAPA are looking at this issue, is a concern that as entities join regional markets, that the bilateral market opportunities decline. And it's sort of the theory that no man wants to be an island. And I think if you talk to the energy traders, that they're already seeing that the EIM participation by Western utilities has caused a decline in the availability of spot market energy transactions. And so as you look at the possibility of creating some sort of a market just for the state of Nevada, I think that you run the risk of having very limited participation in it, because all of the other participants are in the SPP or the CAISO or some other market, and there is not a bilateral market to access.
Thank you for that. Anything further on the possibility of creating a a regional RTO or Nevada leading it, and just wanted to document and note for the record, there isn't a lot of discussion, at least at this workshop, or it seems from reading the members, a lot of interest in that. But I do think it was important to identify in looking at possible options. And again, one of the purposes of this workshop is to identify possible options and decision points for policymakers to look at in going forward. And even the fact that there isn't a lot of discussion or interest or anyone showing up advocating strongly for the creation of that in and of itself, I think, says a lot about that. The other option I think Nevada can look at regarding a wholesale market is what we have already in place. And NV Energy is doing that work right now. And one question in my mind is, if this petition goes forward, is that role something NV Energy is interested in keeping in some respect, or reimagining how it is operated and what that would even look like? Ms. Parvesh, has there been any thought by NV Energy regarding that, or any position regarding that?
Certainly, we've thought about it. We don't have, I think first, before Nevada can decide if question 3 passes, what type of wholesale market it needs to support its retail market work, Nevada's going to need some details on what the retail market looks like. And I know we tried to get some of that yesterday, but it was more generalities yesterday, so maybe we'll get into some of that tomorrow. If NV Energy were to operate an organized wholesale market versus a bilateral market, which it does today, like you mentioned, we do all the things that a system operator does today, we just do it bilaterally. There's things that a system operator needs to be able to do to maintain reliability, and if part of the question 3, the constitutional amendment, is a divestiture of generation assets, that would leave the system operator in Nevada without the ability to maintain reliability, voltage control, balance the system, even participate in the energy imbalance market, because today NV Energy needs resources to make up the difference between all the resource suppliers in Nevada and the loads in order to submit a balanced schedule and pass feasibility tests and participate in that market. And so, I guess, would NV Energy be interested or consider that? It really would depend on what the retail market looks like and what the conditions are around operations.
And thank you for that, and it might be too early to get too far into some of this, but what conditions, just to follow up on your statement, what conditions may be necessary in the retail market that would be favorable to NV Energy in considering taking on that role? In a lot of these conversations that we're having, I think to try to wrap our head around this petition and all the different aspects of it, we try to segregate it into issues, but there's a lot of the chicken and the egg, and they all feed off of each other and play off of each other and influence, what we do with the wholesale market influences the retail market and vice versa.
Right. And I don't know that I can answer. This is also very complicated. And on one hand, it appears that if the constitutional amendment passes, we need to establish an open, competitive market with meaningful choice. And that's sort of all, that's pretty much, it seems like all we know right now from the language. But I don't know how that works with a utility owning generation that could supply 90% of Nevada at the lowest cost prices, lower cost than any other unregulated state. I guess, is that meaningful choice if you have a low-cost provider? So assuming, the NV Energy won't have control of generation, and reliability being the primary priority of system operations, I don't see how those two things can coexist.
No, thank you for that. And I guess what I've had some discussions and around the idea of, we don't necessarily need to recreate the wheel, so to speak. And there is a function that NV Energy is doing, in terms of having, a wholesale market interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of going to, joining CAISO, or looking at trying to create our own, there's already some of that infrastructure, that expertise, that knowledge in place in NV Energy. And even if NV Energy then, was divested of the generation component, would there be an interest by NV Energy or an ability by NV Energy to take on that role?
And I'm not sidetracking the question. I think that I think there would be a lot to be gained by Nevada with NV Energy maintaining what it does today. It's got the employees, it's got the systems, it's got transmission operations, energy management software, resource optimization software, and the employees with the expertise to run that. It's not an organized market with market clearing prices. It's a bilateral market, so there would be some additional cost and to implement something like that. What we would need to figure out is how to maintain reliability. I think you'd really have to set up some sort of a very good market to provide ancillary services and reliability services from supply resources in order for that to be a sound operation, as sound as it is today.
And we're talking about choice. In my mind, if that was a viable option, I would think it would be one that NV Energy, as a business, would want to choose to take on that role. As to having that role, I don't know legally if the state, even if it wanted to, could force that role upon a business. But if there was an interest in that, what would that look like? And that's kind of what I just wanted to put that out there.
And I think Nevada, there's a lot of complexities in the wholesale market operations, and I think Nevada would probably be best served if it does decide to move to a wholesale market, to study all those options, not just pick one and decide that that's the best one and let's do a cost-benefit study on that. I think it needs to be a very serious study. These wholesale markets are very costly, very complicated. They're essentially impossible to unwind once you've done it. It would be hard to take your operations back, create your own balancing area after you've transitioned away from that. And so this decision needs to be taken very seriously for Nevada. Nevada needs to understand what its retail market would look like if the constitutional amendment passes, and what's important to it, how it maintains its state energy policies in the retail market, how it would implement a resource adequacy program. Nevada would be the only state, even in a regional wholesale market, without a regulated utility participating in a state resource planning process to provide resources. So that'll be something different that Nevada would have to do. There's the governance. If it's a regional entity, Nevada's going to have to make sure it has accurate representation, how the transmission planning is done. So there's I think we need to decide in Nevada what we would want out of a wholesale market and study all our options. Given the fact that there are options based on our geographic location.
Do you have any idea of how long a study like that may take?
Well, I guess there's a couple of examples. Ms. Crowley mentioned that the California legislature had the California ISO do a impact study on the state of California. And that included, impacts on its economy and jobs for California, impacts to disadvantaged communities, impacts on emissions, a variety of things. They could probably speak to it better. And they employed 4 expert consulting firms, the Brattle Group, E3, Aspen Environmental, and Bear Economics, to do various aspects of this study. And I believe that took about 6 months to complete, but that was just one option, and that was regionalizing an existing market and the impacts on the state of California. So given that Nevada is would be launching into a new wholesale market and would need to study all, 4 options, it would take significantly more time. And Nevada would need to define which attributes that it thought were important to include in its own impacts on the state of Nevada.
Because from the conversations that we were having yesterday and some of the goals that we discussed with the petition, is allowing for retail choice, to encourage economic development, job creation, growth within the state of Nevada, help maintain our existing renewable energy policies as set forth by the legislature, and that those are the overriding goals of, I think, what the petition is aiming to accomplish. And so I think to construct a wholesale market with those goals in mind, to allow for businesses to come to this state and say, we want to participate in Nevada. We have the service to offer, and how we start attracting those businesses to our state to participate in that.
Right. And I agree with you. The one thing you mentioned as one of the attributes of a potential study would be whether Nevada wanted to cede control of its transmission system and send the revenue for market operations and jobs to another state, or whether it was interested in establishing its own wholesale market here. That would be one of the other impacts of
One thing, an observation as being chair of the PUC, and I experienced this as well as when I was litigating both in civil practice and in criminal practices. Different stakeholders begin to argue about then who does the study, and because then who does the study and then who funds the study arguably lends some influence into the outcome of the study, and that then opens up a whole separate series of side arguments. And then if then somebody doesn't like the outcome of the study, they challenge the study methodology and say because they were paid by a certain person it was biased, and there's a whole nother round of arguments that come into play.
Right. It would have to probably, again, maybe something commissioned by the state of Nevada and paid for by the state of Nevada, and that includes stakeholder input.
Mr. Green, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Michael Green, NV Energy. I actually came up here, I should have known better. My job, I get to work with very smart people. Carolyn Barbash being one of them. She hit all the points I was going to hit. She's 28 years experience, and I should have known better than to make my way to the table so quickly. But the bottom line is these are very complicated issues, very important issues to the state of Nevada. We shouldn't take the decision lightly. I think we hit in our comments, and not to reiterate them, we need to study these, and we need to study them thoroughly and make the right decision that's best for Nevada, and that's what we support.
Is there, if I was going to characterize then the current position of NV Energy right now with respect to the option or the possibility of keeping some of the wholesale market functions intact within NV Energy. What would your position to that suggestion be today? I mean, I hear that we need to look at it and study it more, but in terms as a business entity, is that something you're open to, you want to have further dialogue about, or is it something you say, no way, we have no interest in that whatsoever?
I think our comments make clear what our position is generally, but with respect to that specific question, I think it's, at this point, we don't think it's possible based upon the assumptions, how we interpret the constitutional amendment. This is going to change, this is going to evolve. So to sit here and say that, no, we adamantly aren't going to do it, I can't say that because I don't know what's going to come out of this. NV Energy, we're here, this is going to be a long process, so we're certainly going to be at the table having a conversation with everybody involved, including this commission, the legislature, and various stakeholders.
And I am trying to nail you down a little bit.
I understand, I give you a very lawyer answer.
Well, and the reason is you clearly come out and said you have no interest in being provider of last resort, and made that statement. And I'm just trying to gauge whether there's an interest in even exploring this option. And if the answer is we don't know right now, but assuming it is possible, and I heard from you, Mr. Green, that you don't think it's possible, assuming it is possible, is that something that you're even interested in having that conversation about?
And I think, again, we would need to explore all options in order to do the right thing for Nevada. And I don't want to get into too many details, but the nuance here is reliable system operations requires control over generation supply in order to keep the system balanced, keep the frequency at 60 hertz, provide load pocket service, employ reliability must-run units for things like that. And under a full divestiture scenario, we would need to set up a properly functioning ancillary services market to provide those. I don't know that that makes sense for the utility to divest of generation assets only to purchase them back, for instance, purchase the output back in the case of a reliability must-run unit at the same cost that the customers are already paying for. So the customers pay stranded costs and then again pay the fixed cost in order to supply that reliability services. So NV Energy would explore things, but would always want to do only something that would be successful and reliable.
And the reason I'm just pushing, at least on this issue, is that we're just having the conversation, because I have had folks mention to me, this will be easy, just have NV Energy do what they're doing right now, just in a little bit of a different role. And it doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. And I want to hear your thoughts on that, and from what I'm hearing from you is it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Volz.
Yes, let me suggest a remedy for this situation. First of all, it seems as though one of the most important things, if NVE was to do this on an ongoing basis, is the information transmission between the new retailers, if the initiative passes, or the generators. And so to the extent that that can be worked out, that probably will go a long way towards solving some of the concerns that were just indicated. But I think the simple way that you deal with this situation is create an RFP process. Let CAISO, Southwest Power Plan, whomever, along with NVE, if they choose to pursue it, submit a sealed bid. Somebody reviews it. I don't know whether the Governor's Office of Energy would put the parameters together or somebody else within the state, and see what you get back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that suggestion. With respect to discussions on the Southwest Power Pool, is there anyone who would like to provide some more comment or context to that? For example, how would Nevada even connect to interconnect with the Southwest Power Pool? Mr. Volz.
Yes, again, Frederick Volz for the record. In looking at some of the documentation from the Southwest Power Pool, it was mentioned this morning, I believe by the NDRC, that it was a $6,000 a year membership fee. But the other side of that is that if you choose to exit, the fee is almost $700,000. And that's significant, I think, for ratepayers and for anybody else who would choose to join them. But looking at the map here on the board to the side of the tables, there really aren't the connection points to get the electricity to Nevada from the far reaches of New Mexico, basically right on the border with Texas, which is where their service area currently ends. The best we could hope for would be to get it to Farmington, which is the far northwest corner of New Mexico, and then use some of those high-capacity lines to bring it toward Nevada. But the lines to get from Farmington to the other side of the state really don't exist in enough capacity to make a difference presently.
Thank you. With respect to Mr. Volt's comment, in the map that we do have here in the Carson City office, and I understand that anyone watching this over the web might not be able to see that, but it is an outline of Western United States and some of the transmission lines that run throughout California and Oregon and Washington and Nevada and parts of Arizona, Utah, and Idaho. And wanted to put that here in the room to just illustrate some tremendous gaps, or holes, so to speak, throughout Nevada. In that, as I mentioned earlier this morning, electricity is different than other commodities, even, for example, the internet or the telephone, where you can send the product or the service through the air, so to speak. There needs to be actual, true physical infrastructure that connect the points together in order to transfer this commodity from where it's produced to where it's ultimately used. And so in that respect, energy is very different than other resources that we use. One thing that comes to my mind too, also I have my friends from CASIO here, is with respect to building new transmission lines in Nevada. If the state of Nevada had the need, because of its growth, to have new transmission lines, and we did join CAISO, would we have to go to the CAISO governing board in order to get approval for the building of those new lines?
Keith Casey, California ISO. Chair Reynolds, the short answer would be any new transmission lines that were recommended out of our planning process would be approved by the ISO board. So we would have to attain board approval of new transmission lines.
Well, thank you. So I guess the answer is yes. And with respect to Nevadans paying for, when I look at those transmission lines in California, there's quite a few. Would Nevadans be charged a portion of what it costs to build that infrastructure if we join CAISO for those transmission lines already in place or new ones being built?
Under the proposed transmission cost framework that we developed last year as part of our efforts to explore regionalism, and as we discussed this morning, what we've proposed is that each area would retain cost of its own embedded transmission. So in that scenario, Nevada would not be picking up any of the costs of the existing ISO transmission. Those costs would be recovered by the ISO ratepayers as they exist today. Similarly, Nevada would carry the cost of its existing transmission within its own footprint. But then going forward, to the extent there's new transmission that provides benefits to the greater region, there would have to be some agreement on cost sharing.
So if the CAISO governing board decided to build a new transmission line within the state of California, it's theoretically possible Nevadans, even though that infrastructure wasn't built in Nevada, Nevadans, if we join CAISO, would have to pay a portion of that.
To be honest, those are details in the proposal that we never resolved completely. There was debate in the stakeholder process about whether a transmission line that resided within one area's footprint, but perhaps provide benefits to a neighboring area, would share in the cost, or would the facility have to physically cross into the region? So I think that's a policy detail that would have to be further explored to decide, to qualify for regional cost allocation, does the new transmission line have to physically cross into the sub-regions? Or could you have a situation where it's in one sub-region entirely, but it's providing benefits to the neighboring region that would warrant cost sharing? That's a policy detail we never fully resolved.
And again, I just think it's important to talk about that, because even when we talk about building transmission infrastructure, that's jobs. People have to actually get out there and build them, and the surveying and the construction that's just involved with that, and then it's adding to that particular state's infrastructure resources. And again, I know that these are tough. These are some tougher questions, but I think it's important that we address them. But as we're looking at all angles of this, Mr. Williger, good afternoon.
Thank you, Chairman. DeBridge Willer for staff, for the record. I do think I don't disagree with anything Mr. Casey said. I do think some of that's governed by FERC Order 1000. And there's a test that's laid out there that talks about whether it benefits the region, which he mentioned, and also if it facilitates the policy objectives of the state. So I think we could look to the framework that was set up in FERC Order 1000 to see whether if a transmission line is built wholly in California, whether that could potentially be charged to Nevada customers.
So let me get this straight.
Assuming I know, but
If we join CAISO, we need to look to an order by the federal government to decide whether a transmission line built in California needs to be paid partly by Nevada ratepayers.
I think FERC Order 1000 sets up a framework for how those cost sharing happens in an RTO or ISO, yes.
Sir, go ahead.
FERC Order 1000 provides some principles, probably the most important of which is cost causation. I think FERC has demonstrated a lot of deference to cost allocations that various ISO RTOs put forward. So I don't think it follows strictly that if you have a line that's, say, solely within the California footprint today, under FERC Order 1000, if that provided benefits to a neighboring subregion, the cost would have to be shared. I think that's something that, when you look at what's been approved in other ISO RTOs, I think we have some latitude in terms of how we handle that. And again, that's a detail that could be resolved if we were to continue the stakeholder process to work through that. And ultimately, we could see where FERC comes out on that policy.
And so your belief is that some of those concerns can be resolved through agreement, upon any, conditions that the state of Nevada might join CAISO. We could negotiate, some of the terms of that.
Our experience in looking at the precedents with FERC is if a large region can agree on some cost allocation rules that largely align with Order 1000 principles, they'll give a lot of deference and flexibility to what that structure looks like.
Thank you. Mr. Van Cleve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brad Van Cleve for Valley Electric Association. I just wanted to point out that Nevada could well be subject to allocation of these costs for transmission assets built in other states, even if they don't join an ISO. that for Order 1000 requires inter-regional transmission planning and potentially cost allocation. And so there's a group called West Connect that a number of the utilities in the Southwest are participating in. And so that possibility of transmission assets in other states that would provide a benefit to Nevada, for example, as a path to export solar resources, for example, could result in Nevada being allocated some of those costs. So it's really a transmission planning construct that transcends sort of whether you're in an ISO or not.
So thank you for that, Mr. Van Cleve. And I don't want the folks from CAISO to think they're being beaten up here today or this morning, and very much appreciate you being here. Part of, again, this workshop is to underturn some of the stones, so to speak, and a lot of what I've heard, has been presentations, and when anybody does a presentation, they put their best foot forward, and they make their situation as attractive as possible, and that's naturally what everybody does. In here, we need to look at some of the, asking some of the tougher questions today to look at the other sides of that. I very much appreciate the willingness to try to answer these questions, because I don't think there's ever a perfect solution on some of these complex issues going forward. It's a matter of Nevada policymakers deciding the best fit, given all the circumstances, the good and the bad, what we know and what we don't know, and what the challenges are. And I just wanted to, again, bring those to the forefront and shine some light on those. So, again, ask the folks that CAISO not to feel picked on at all today. Please don't. I very much welcome your participation. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to anyone here in Carson City who would like to give any comments about today's topics regarding the creation of a wholesale market. Ask anyone to generally limit their comments to 3 minutes. And so if there's anyone in Carson City who would like to give any comment.
Chairman, for the record, Dylan Sullivan, again, from the Natural Resources Defense Council. I will try to stay to 3 minutes. I know I can be long-winded. So I wanted to respond to an earlier question you had about would linking with the CAISO system basically inhibit Nevada's development of its renewable energy potential. And just a few points there. So first, I think California's excess solar problem, it's a seasonal issue, and it's something that could be well on its way to being solved. And I think the reason to think it might be being solved is just because more states and more utilities are having similar conversations to the one that we're having here today about linking more closely with California's system. And if you have more loads that can be served under that system, it creates more opportunities for that solar to find a customer. And so just as we're having this conversation today, other states are also looking at linking with California's system. We talked a little bit about the New Mexico proceeding about whether New Mexico should join, or New Mexico's utility should join the Mountain West Transmission Group. NRDC and with the Project for a Sustainable FERC put comments into that proceeding about encouraging the New Mexico utilities to look at CAISO. And I think some utilities there have already joined the energy imbalance market. And CAISO has put forth a stakeholder process about expanding the EIM or allowing EIM participants to opt into the day-ahead market. And I think that would create further opportunities to soak up some of that seasonal excess. And I think CAISO made this point up here, but project owners, those who own California solar facilities don't like selling electricity at negative prices. So they really have an incentive to figure out this problem, and using things like energy storage is something that a lot of people are looking at. So finally, in terms of creating opportunities for Nevada to export electricity, I think there's actually no better partner than California. With California's high and increasing RPS, that creates a demand for Nevada solar and geothermal, and we've actually already seen California utilities scoop up some expiring Nevada geothermal PPAs that were held by NV Energy. So there is a lot of interest in using Nevada resources to meet that policy. And others who are more involved in development can make this point better than me, but it's always going to be cheaper to build a project in Nevada than it is in California for a lot of different reasons. So I think that gets to sort of the...
What reasons?
So I think labor is more expensive in California. I think there's also a more intense environmental permitting process through CEQA. I think it's just land is more expensive in California. So I think there are a few reasons why that's the case. And so that's kind of the other side of the coin of Nevada's, the governor's goal that Nevada be a leading producer and consumer of renewable energy is the consumer side. So what policies are there to make sure that Nevada kind of doesn't just export, but uses it here? And I think that's where our policy, like the RPS, comes in. And that policy can ensure that we do get development in Nevada for Nevada going forward.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you.
Anyone else in Carson City would like to comment? Mr. Van Cleve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brad Van Cleve for Valley Electric again. I want to address the same point. We believe that joining the CAISO increases the market for Nevada renewable resources. And we would also agree that there is a definite competitive advantage both in the quality of the solar sites available, lower cost of land, lower cost of labor, and significantly easier permitting processes. And at Valley Electric, we've had a number of solar developers looking to build large-scale solar facilities in Valley's footprint to send to California to load-serving entities who want to meet the RPS standard. And currently there are 1,400 megawatts of solar facilities in VEA's service area that have applied for interconnection to the grid. And as California moves toward a 100% renewable standard, we see that sort of increasing.
Thank you. What would your response be to some of the downsides that we discussed about this morning in joining CAISO?
Can you be more specific?
With respect to the governance and the issues surrounding governing structure, issues surrounding Nevadans looking at having to pay for transmission infrastructure, the possibility of greater FERC oversight over some of the transactions that occur with respect to Nevada. I'm just looking to see if you had a broad opinion of that you think those things can be resolved or worked out if people sit around a table and roll up their sleeves, and that whether you think those are something that can be overcome or not.
Yes, I think they can be overcome. For example, if you look at the governance question, it was a major issue with the development of the EIM market, and they were able to create an independent mechanism to deal with that. And we're pretty confident that we could do that in the context of expansion of the ISO regionally.
Thank you. And again,
And on the cost allocation question, I think, as some folks said earlier today, there's a lot of, this is a common problem as entities join organized markets across the country. So if you look at the MISO and PJM and the SPP, there's this idea of zonal rates so that you don't get impacted by other regions that have much higher cost structures. And so I think that's something that can be implemented, and I think you heard Mr. Casey said that's something that the ISO is willing to do. And then you're just talking about future facilities. And the principle there is cost causation and who's benefiting from these facilities. So I think the cost issue can be worked out as well.
Thank you, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot on asking you those while you're up here, but I think those answers are important to have on the record.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in Carson City who'd like to make comment?
For the record, Fred Volz. To circle around to the options that you laid out as far as how the state might proceed, Chair, I go to slide 9 from CASIO's presentation to the Governor's Committee on Energy Choice. And at the very top of that slide, they are indicating that creating a new ISO for this state could cost upwards of $500 million. Juxtaposed with $3 billion of revenue presently for the incumbent utility, which does include some natural gas, but doesn't include the co-ops. That's a lot of money for just one small function of the puzzle here that we're trying to solve. They also went on to say that when they created their own ISO in California in 2009, that it cost $200 million, and that Texas in the 90s, when they created ERCOT, spent $600 million. So those numbers that they're tentatively throwing out for us in this state seem very high for what would be done, certainly in relationship to whatever NVE is spending presently. Another document that CAISO issued just a few days ago is titled ISO 2016-2017 Transmission Planning Process with the subtitle of Interregional Transmission Project Evaluation and 50% RPS Out-of-State Portfolio Assessment. And the sum of it is that CAISO wants to build enough transmission between Wyoming and California and New Mexico and California to import 2,000 megawatts from each state of wind power to help meet its renewable power standard. And if for the Wyoming to California piece, Nevada is only acting as sort of a conduit, if you will, I don't see where we get the benefit from building a lot of new renewable energy if that's the state's public policy. We're just on the way delivering it from Wyoming, and that's sort of the end of the discussion, it would seem. But I would encourage both the Southwest Power Project and CAISO, if they're going to go forward, to give us some sort of cost range of what they think it's going to cost to run this, even independent of a request for proposal. We don't have that at this point. We've been speaking in very vague generalities about all these benefits and things, but let's put some hard numbers to them, just as we need to do with all the rest of the renewable energy and energy choice issues, and that has not been done, unfortunately, still. I'd also like to suggest that there's a security issue that hasn't been discussed yet, and that by connecting to a much larger, more attractive target, either an EMF type attack or even just computer hackers, and Equifax, Target, Home Depot, there are lots of examples of people who thought they had secure systems, and there really is no secure system anywhere when it comes to IT, could have a very negative impact and bring down multiple areas, including this state. So having an independent ISO of our own, or operating it in such a way through an entity such as NVE, would seem to make a lot of strategic sense from that standpoint. And finally, to your point about the governance on a possible alliance with a larger ISO, I would say you invoke the United Nations Security Council option, which is that any one member of that Security Council can veto a proposal. It doesn't need to be a majority vote. And so how you would apply that, how you would allow it to be applied, is obviously something up for discussion, but that would be an approach.
I appreciate you bringing that up, Mr. Volz, because I actually had made the comment in another conversation that if the United Nations can figure this out, we should be able to as well.
True.
So thank you for that.
Just one other comment very briefly, and that is, in that same situation, I think our state has very little control over how the general and administrative costs of another ISO would be allocated back to us if we only have one seat at the table out of 5. Thank you.
And before you start with your comments, I want to see if is there a cost range that CAISO can provide, if not right now, maybe in our follow-up workshops next week, of what we might be looking at least even a range.
In terms of if you were to join if the ISO were to become a regional market operator.
Yes, in terms of what we'd be looking at in terms of costs to Nevadans.
We can look to it, see if we can provide that.
Even upfront costs, but overall costs, as much as you can provide or crystallize that, because that's very relevant, I think, in the decision-making, will be relevant in the decision-making process going forward, is how to do this with build the best that we can, but also cheapest that we can. And so any more information that you can provide for that would be helpful, because I think Mr. Volz's point, I think is well taken by me, is so far we talk a lot about in generalities, and a lot of, well, it'll be up to the Nevada legislature. The legislature will figure it out. We'll get to the point where it would be helpful to have more than that. And so that when somebody has to start typing up what a BDR looks like or what law changes need to be made, there's some ideas of what those really, really look like, as opposed to us just kind of pushing it off to the future or to another entity. So any follow-up next week that you can provide on that would be really helpful.
We'll do our best to provide more information on that.
And thank you, and so I'll let you go ahead and make your comments. So
thank you. I just wanted to respond to Mr. Volz's comments about the ISO studies he referenced regarding transmission to access resources in Wyoming, New Mexico, and simply just to clarify that those were informational studies that were done per the bequest of the California Public Utilities Commission, which again really further exemplifies the deference we give states on procurement decisions. So they're exploring different ways to achieve 50% RPS and beyond, and looking at out-of-state procurement scenarios as part of that. So we offered to provide those technical studies to just help inform what it would take in the way of additional transmission to support renewables. But we really leave that to the state and the utilities to ultimately decide how they meet their RPS targets.
thank you. Is there anyone else in Carson City who would like to make a comment? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chairman. My name is Ellen Wolf, and I'm a consultant representative for Valley Electric. And I just wanted to contribute a little bit on this last discussion about those studies as well.
Thank you for being here.
Oh, I'm pleased to be here. Thanks for having me. The California Public Utilities Commission has implemented in the last year or so a really sophisticated way of trying to inform its load-serving entities of where the most desirable renewable resources are. They've called it their integrated resource planning process. And out of that process, one of the choices has been to just look at what's cheapest today versus what might be cheapest under a broader view. And because of that, they've made this request to the ISO to do this study about wind resources in Nevada and Wyoming, because on their own merits, they wouldn't naturally get selected because they require both transmission and the renewable build-out. But in the study itself, while the tools that the CPUC is using didn't select naturally that Nevada and Wyoming wind, it did select 3,000 megawatts of renewable resources in southern Nevada, the part of southern Nevada that's in the CAISO grid now and can deliver directly into the grid. So when the next transmission planning process comes around, the ISO will look at actually what those actual portfolios are and decide whether it's worthwhile to build out its transmission system that would help deliver those resources. So that IRP process is identifying southern Nevada resources is very desirable. And that process is just solely driven on California's own RPS requirement. So just sort of trying to connect all the questions today about, well, won't it disadvantage us if we interconnect? No, the reality is while there might be energy during these peak solar periods, there's still a lot of demand for the build-out, and that build-out is getting chosen by the California Public Utilities Commission as landing in southern Nevada. If more of Nevada was in the ISO footprint and could be directly deliverable, it would likely pick a lot more renewable resources as well. So I wouldn't see the choice of the request for the study to weigh in on really where the desirable renewable resources are showing up.
No, thank you. And with respect to your comments, unfortunately, right now in Nevada, we don't have a lot of harvestable wind resources here in the state. And I've met with numerous folks in the wind industry, and so we don't have a whole lot of large-scale wind farms here in the state at this point.
Well, actually, though, the wind resources and the potential that have been identified in southern Nevada are really quite good, even compared to California's remaining wind resources. California is getting quite saturated, and to interconnect from New Mexico or Wyoming is quite expensive. And so it's quite likely as the solar penetration goes up that actually the wind resources in southern Nevada will bubble to the top of desirability. They're just not there right now compared to solar. But as
that's good to know.
So yeah, so they're there, and the geothermal is quite attractive as well.
As some have told me, we don't yet have the sweet wind or the A+ wind. But if we will in the future, that's great to know, because I always tell them no one knows a windmill more than I do.
And so if you speak with the California ISO transmission planning folks, they're really interested in the Nevada wind because it has a different profile than the California wind does. So it helps in their quote-unquote duck curve problem. So
truly, that's good to know
about the wind.
Because some of my comments just while we're talking about the wind is it's always windy in Washoe Valley when you're driving from Carson City to Reno. It's rare when it's not, and so when I hear there's not enough wind in Nevada, and I grew up in Vegas, and it was always windy, and I was always trying to reconcile that. So it's good to hear that different perspective.
Chin up about the wind. I think it'll come.
All right.
Chairman DeBridge Willard from staff for the record, and this, just one small point, and I think this could come out in any study we do for how we integrate and the synergies with CAISO, and again, not to pick on our friends from CAISO here, but we did staff looked at whether Nevada Power or Sierra Pacific has ever peaked on the same day or in the same hour as CAISO to sort of examine if we could get this 900 megawatt capacity benefit, what exists. And it is the case that they've never peaked on the same day, but in 2016 they were off just by one day. So I think this will all come out in the study, but we just want to note that the peak day time for the Nevada entities, the Nevada utilities, and CAISO has come very close. So if that were the case and they would peak on the same day and in the same hour, that capacity benefit could be swallowed up. So I just wanted to note that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Torlicker. Anyone in Las Vegas that would like to give any comment? Hearing and seeing none. A few thoughts before I want to conclude today's workshop. And some things again on my mind from today's discussion is, has a state such as Nevada ever transitioned to a competitive market without already being a member or participant in a marketplace? Are we looking at doing something new? Not a bad thing if we are, but a question in my mind is there already a roadmap there? And as well, I would ask that with respect to any of the discussion topics that came up today, questions that came up today, I intend to revisit those at the workshop that will be on this next week, and revisit some of these discussions to see if any additional information or insight can be provided by anyone who's a stakeholder here today or anyone new that might show up next week at the meeting. My intent for tomorrow's workshop, which will be day 3, is to look at options reasonably available to Nevada in designing and establishing a competitive retail electric service market, including but not limited to the relative pros and cons, the best practices and structure for Nevada, and options for a service provider of last resort. And I think the service provider of last resort is often in the energy realm. We refer to as the polar, is fundamental question at hand. And how do we secure providers of last resort for all areas of Nevada? You know, we have 17 counties in this state and a very diverse geographic region. And as we can see from the infrastructure map, some of the areas of Nevada have good infrastructure and some of our areas are underdeveloped. But everyone who lives there needs to have electricity and reliable electricity. And so to me, that's one of the most important issues in these workshops that still need to be discussed. I want to thank everyone for coming today and taking their time to have these discussions on the record. And I look forward to seeing everyone here tomorrow. And with that, we'll conclude today's workshop. Thank you.